Welcome to the Beyond the Bestseller podcast. I'm your host, Kelly Schugnecht, and today's guest is Zoë Routh, author of People Stuff. Let's get into it. Well, hello, Zoë. Thank you so much for joining me on the Beyond the Bestseller podcast. I'd love to start out by having you introduce yourself, if you would.
Thanks, Kelly. I am super thrilled to be here, of course, talking everything books and especially best-selling books. Woo! I am a leadership futurist, and I'm Canadian originally and now live in Australia. And the work that I do with clients is about helping them identify what's coming in the future so that we can prepare for it now as leaders moving to what's next.
Got it. Okay. So I thought you were in Australia. Then when we started talking, I thought you don't have an Australian accent. So that the Canada roots explain that. Okay. So you, before we started recording, you mentioned how many books you have. So tell me about how many books you have.
At the time of this recording, I have 7 out there. I have the 8th, which is a fiction book about to come out, and the 9th that's going through the editing process at the moment. Okay. And I have got a 10th that's going to be for later in 2025.
So you've got a lot going on there. Yeah. I when you said that, I was like, I've got to make sure I get you to say that because that's a lot. And the interesting thing that hit me, so the book that drew me to you was People Stuff, but you also have, oh, look at that. You have the copy handy right there. I love the cover, but you also have fiction books. So kind of tell me about that. You have fiction and nonfiction. You have platform kind of leadership, but then, how did all of that kind of come about?
Yeah, it was, so I wrote 4 leadership books, and the 4th one was People Stuff. And as I was writing People Stuff, I was 2020, so the pandemic was all happening. I decided I want to double down on my writing skills, so I took a writing course with Stephen Kotler at the Flow Research Collective. And in the conversation there, I asked him, what's the difference between fiction and nonfiction from your point of view? And he said something quite profound. He said, fiction is about advancing a life. Nonfiction is about advancing an idea. I'm like, okay, cool. And then as I was progressing through the course and I was reading widely to look at the craft of writing, I was reading fabulous Ursula K. Le Guin's books, the Wizard series. And as I was reading, I'm like, wow, that's really powerful insights about humanity and purpose and relationships. And a ping idea, I'm like, could fiction be a great way to teach or showcase leadership? But not in a parable format. Like, I don't really particularly like parable format. I really like novels. And so I thought, maybe it could be. And so it became a bridge for me a little bit. So as a leadership futurist, I'm doing a lot of futurist work, looking at what are the trends that are impacting us, what could be possible future scenarios. And that naturally led to the concept of science fiction, and because science fiction is about creating possible future worlds. And that was the bridge for me. So I went from leadership into fiction, sci-fi in particular, to explore what these possible worlds could look like and ask the important question from a leadership point of view is, what's the kind of leadership that we'll need to contend with these possible future worlds? And that was the genesis of book number 1 in a series. This one's called The Olympus Project. And it sort of sets the scene of what's happening in this near future. It's about 30 to 50 years out, climate ravaged world. We have to live and work differently. What does that mean in terms of leadership and community? And so, yeah, that's how it started, if you like. So kind of little branches. And I've written 3 novels are out. And the 4th one, as I mentioned, is about to come out. And then my 5th nonfiction will come out after that. So after a 5-year break from nonfiction, I'm coming back to nonfiction as well.
So I'm glad I asked you that question because I was not expecting that answer at all. That's really, really interesting how, I thought maybe you just kind of had a passion for writing. You were writing some books and, then it led to, you're writing some for pleasure and some for work kind of thing. But that's really, really interesting how you kind of turned that what you do into like a fiction kind of concept. Was that a series? Did you say those
the
Olympus book? So
I set out to write a series, it's
Okay.
called the Gaia Enterprises series.
Okay.
So it's based on this new organization called Gaia Enterprises, which has as its philosophy to build communities that inspire advancement of human leadership and human leadership maturity. And so their architectural designs have that in mind. So it's all about creating collective, collaborative futures. And they run up against people and organizations and politics that are not that. And so
Yeah.
it's a little bit of a struggle of ideologies as well. So yes, it is a series. There's a prequel that I wrote after the first book, so out of order. And then the first two novels and the third one's about to come out.
Okay. Well, that is incredible. That's just such an amazing kind of I don't know, portfolio of all of these things that you're doing. So I want to focus on the nonfiction books, but I did want to
Yep.
hear kind of all of like how all of that came together for you. But the people stuff is what got my attention, um, because listeners of this podcast are interested in nonfiction books, specifically things that are kind of helpful in the professional world or in their even just like personal growth type books. But so I'd love to kind of dive into that one a little bit more, and have you tell me kind of what is that book about? Why did you write that book in the first place?
Uh, Thank you for the question. So people stuff came about, oh geez, it's probably a lifetime of pondering on what makes people tick, and all the work that I'd done today. So my professional life started at the age of 17, leading canoe trips in Northwest Ontario in summer camp, which led me to 9 years working at Outward Bound here in Australia, which is all about personal leadership development in the outdoors. And throughout those, I was very intensive team growth experiences,
Mm-hmm.
and continually figuring out what makes a good team, what doesn't make a good team, what works as a team leader, what doesn't work, my own failings as a leader, and there was many of those, which moved into eventually setting up my own leadership development practice. And one of the constant chronic issues I had with leaders was their people stuff. The leading teams was often the most challenging thing. And the surprise and that new leaders also had, that when they moved into management or their first leadership role, how much time and energy it took just to deal with people's issues. They said, it takes up so much energy and effort. I'm like, it does. So I wanted to create a resource that helped give people maps of what's happening in people dynamics and the tools to respond to those, as well as to be preventative, to create systems behind the scenes that set them up for success when it came to working as a team and those collective interactions, which can create friction. So this book is really about perspective, and I believe perspective is power. The first part of the book unpacks how you develop perspective, and by looking far, deep, and wide. And I sort of fuse a little bit of my leadership futurist work into that. So some strategic thinking there, and apply it to people dynamics. And one of the misconceptions around people dynamics is that people often think it's personality problems. That's what causes the headbutting. My premise is that it's not always just that. Below the surface, it's often that systems are the root cause of some of these
Mm.
tensions. So if we get our systems right, we can reduce a lot of the friction that we experience in teams. And so then I go on to unpack some of the troublesome behavior that we see in teams, which I call the four devils of people stuff, which is a central part of the book as well.
Okay, got it. So I am very familiar with the DISC assessment. Do you know?
Yeah.
Okay. So and for people listening who aren't familiar with that, and I am in no way a coach on this. I just am familiar with it from having taken the test on it. So or like the assessments. So the DISC assessment is it breaks people up into four different categories. D being dominant, I influence, S steadiness, I think is the word or something like that, and then
Or
C
supportiveness.
conscientious.
Yeah.
Yeah, supportive. Okay, so and so as a leader, I tend to look at people through that lens, like where I think of like well, this person is communicating this way because they're, a D personality, or this person is like really easy to work with because they're an S personality or whatever. Um, so anyway, I know of that kind of framework or whatever you call it. What do you call that? That
It's a
theory,
model.
that's model. Thank you. um, anyway, so you were saying like it's not the personalities, it's the systems. So do you also take into, I guess, into like consideration the different, like how do personalities work within the systems? Because some people, like well, see, so I am a CS on the disc. So like I am a systems person, right?
Mhm.
But like an I is not going to work within systems very easily, right? So isn't it somewhat a combination of the two things, or like how do you take somebody's work style, their own like approach to things, and mix that with like how the systems need to work for everyone to work together well?
It's a very astute observation. I love the disc as a map and framework. In fact, I used it this week with a team. So we did that as a starting point for their culture day to look at behavior preferences and how people like to work at work. And so absolutely that forms part of how people come together and operate. And disc, like the couple of maps that I offer in this book, are a suite of tools that we can use to help decipher what's going on. And disc is a great one because it helps us unpack a little bit. Why do I get along so well with that person? What is it about
Mm-hmm.
how they approach work that I find easy? And what is it about that person and the way that they approach work that I find difficult? So absolutely, that feeds into it. DISC is less about personality, more about behavior preferences, though they're kind of intertwined. So if you look at other personality behavior profiling tools like Myers-Briggs, say, for example, which speaks specifically to the hard wiring of personality as opposed to DISC, which
Mm-hmm.
is behavioral flexibility, they're linked, but they're linked. So they don't replace one another, if you like. So all of these things feed into the factor of why is it that I get along with some and I don't get along with others. So yes,
Mm-hmm.
I would say that there are elements of the human, the packaging that they show up in, the hard wiring and the soft wiring programming that they bring to the table creates part of the mix. So yeah, that could have filled probably another couple of books looking at,
Yeah.
let's look at personality architecture, behavior preferences, and other decipherables. And I allude to some of those a little bit with the leadership maturity framework, which is yet another map to look at how people are seeing the world, their values, and how they operate in the world. So all of those things create a layered and nuanced way of understanding how people get along. The more you have an understanding of these maps, the more versatile you can be. And often when I'm
Mm.
coaching leaders, I'll say, okay, let's talk about this situation. And as I'm coaching, I'm thinking, well, there's probably a couple of different frameworks that can lend insight into this situation in order for the leader to then decipher what's going to happen next, what decision or interaction are they going to take next to help solve some of these challenges. It's all
Mm-hmm.
good.
But it all starts with like what you're saying, like the systems that you have in place. And then when you have those in place, then, depend, whatever the personality, whatever the, however they fit on all of those
Yeah.
scales, if you have the systems right in the first place, that's
Yeah.
how you can, um, I mean, basically how you lead a team, like that you
Yeah.
can, try to
Well, here's an
like,
example of how it works together. And thank you for raising this as an idea to explore a bit further. So the work that I did this week with a team. So we had a whole
mm-hmm,
day. It was focused on culture development day. We did the disc to start off with to look at people's behavior preferences. The afternoon was about setting in place some systems and agreements so that they, knowing what they knew then about each other, how can they work better together? And so the
mm-hmm,
systems that they put in place were team agreements. I called it a culture charter, do's and don'ts of how they would like to work together. So some specific team agreements, which is an element of a system. And then
yep,
what can they do to create accountability to each other to make sure that they adhere to these commitments to one another? So they put those in place in terms of meeting up once a month to talk about how things are going in the culture, to celebrate quarterly those who are upholding the culture. And with the understanding of that they all have different ways of working and approach things a little bit differently, they also created a tip sheet of do's and don'ts for the individual profiles as
okay,
well. And even more into that, they developed a collaboration handbook where they identified their pet peeves, how they like to receive feedback, and what else? Um, how to show them appreciation. So things that aren't necessarily particular to the disc profile, but adds another layered nuance level. So that's a way that it both fits together. So you can look at the profiles, the differences, and then create a system of agreements and practices that can help us move forward even with those differences. And we can bridge them and celebrate them and leverage the differences because they're complementary. They can seem conflictual, but they're often complementary.
So those systems kind of are creating the culture of the team, like the way
Yes.
that you describe that. So the having the, I mean, I'm even thinking of like, here's how we communicate or where we communicate, and like making that there, everyone's agreeing to this is how this is going to work. And so I love that. Then I wonder, like, so what happens when you do have that, like, I personality who maybe goes rogue because they're not such a systems person, right? Or whatever, whichever. Not going to pick on. I'm a C personality, so like I and
I know the
C
eyes
and
are
I are
freaks for
opposite,
you.
right? So like, yeah. Right, I'm obviously picking on the one that's the most opposite of me. But anyways, anyone in that, if somebody is not abiding by like the here's the rules or the systems that we've created as a team, how do you what do you do at that point, like as the leader or as a team member? How do you approach that person or the problem that's being kind of you're being faced with?
There's two parts to that. The first part is embedding it in the team agreements and systems up front. I had that question actually first thing in the morning when somebody said, what happens when someone goes rogue, to use your
Yeah.
terminology? And
Was
it
it a C
doesn't,
personality asking that?
no, it was
Probably.
an S actually.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Um, and so we had a conversation about the team agreements and then how we're going to actually create personal accountability, which is when they have their, in this case, they were meeting weekly team meetings, checking in with each of them and saying, okay, how you have to report back to the group. How did you honor and show up? Did you honor the agreements or not? So rather than, as opposed to calling out everybody else, it's more about, okay, if I have to report to the team about did I honor the agreements or did I fudge them a little, then that's creating a sense of mea culpa, or yes, I'm all in and I did it. So that's one of the practices of starting a weekly debrief or a monthly debrief where we talk about our individual contributions or lack of contributions to the culture. So having set the expectation that everybody's responsible for culture and that we all agree to uphold these particular leadership practices and behavior practices, the checking in part closes the circle a little bit. So that's one way of ensuring accountability, is to have that debriefing practice. Another one is to have measures in place where you're tracking how the culture is evolving. And you can use something very simple like the employee net promoter score to track the temperature, if you like, of the culture, which is simply getting everybody to rate how likely are you to recommend this place as a good place to work. That's one simple measure. There's other ones that you could put in place as well. Another way to look at this, to create that accountability, is to have 360 feedback or matrix feedback around culture contributions. Setting the practice of having fierce and forthright conversations is essential for doing this well. Because if that's not part of your team practices, then the debrief is not going to go anywhere anyway, because people are just going to say mute because they feel that it's not safe to talk about the conversation. So there's some deep-seated psychological safety work that needs to happen as part of the team setup as well. So there's a collective group team process, and then there's the individual accountability of calling people out if they do transgress, and having the courage to raise that with the person and not behind the scenes and tattle to mom or dad, whoever the boss is. And that is also an individual practice. So there's a bit of a collective practice as well as individual courage and collectivity to create it, as well as the systems that create the safety to do all this well. So there's a lot to actually put in place just to have people talk about how we're getting along.
Yeah. And so you mentioned going and telling the mom and dad or the boss or whatever, so that's to say that like everyone on the team then is responsible for giving that type of feedback to, so I guess let me turn that into a question. So like, so we're a team and we have a leader and somebody has gone rogue or whatever, somebody's doing something, we've decided that we're communicating in this way and they've decided that they're going to do it a different way. is it on the team members then to give that feedback to that person who has gone and done it their own way, or is it the responsibility of the leader to do that, or I guess both? What do you
It's
recommend for
both. It's
that?
yes, and
Mm-hmm.
ideally, as peers, we develop such a robust way of working, of deep respect, that we feel capable of saying, hey, Kelly, I noticed yesterday in the meeting we agreed to blah, and today you're doing Y. What's up with that? And so that sort of individual challenging, which people find really confronting, especially at a peer level, is something that we can develop together. So it's an individual responsibility. And yet, and this is the end yet, if the team has not yet got to that stage where it is capable of having those kinds of robust conversations, or the individuals do not have yet the skills to
Yeah.
self-awareness skills to do it, or the emotional resilience and emotional intelligence to do it, then it falls upon the leader to do it. And if the leader doesn't do it, then things go really pear-shaped. So basically it's the leader should be the catch-all, but shouldn't be the one to do it all the time.
Yeah.
And if the leader doesn't do it, then what happens is the culture goes toxic, and you have all
Mm-hmm.
sorts of other cascading effects as a result of that. And power games emerge, which is the subject of my next nonfiction book, actually.
Like an early plug for that one.
That was
Yeah, I
totally an
just
early plug.
I just wondered about that because I have but I have worked on a team where like for example, the leader was the one, if anyone would say, hey, this happened, that we had this issue, or not complaining about a team member, but saying, bringing to the leader's attention that there was an
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah.
And he would say, well, everyone else, like everyone needs to give the feedback in the moment, like it can't just come to me, and I would say, yeah, but like it didn't always feel like it was my place to give somebody feedback, because it wasn't. But some of that, like going back to the whole premise of the book, right, is we didn't have the systems, we didn't have these agreements as far as how things should be done, or how, so then it felt weird feedback coming from me to a peer or somebody on somebody else's team, basically, is what this situation was. It was like, I can see that there's this thing happening, that somebody needs to give this person feedback, but I also don't feel like it should be coming from me. They don't report to me, they report to somebody else, but if we had the systems in place, then that probably would have made it more of the culture that we can give feedback across teams, or whatever. Anyway, that's why I asked that, but it is such a complicated thing, because if the culture is not a feedback heavy culture, then
Yeah.
it feels weird to give feedback, right? Like, so you have
That's
to,
right.
as a leader, start that with your systems in place. And then but I also like how you mentioned, but then the leader has to be the catch-all. So if that feedback's not happening, then it's up to the leader to identify why that's not happening, and make sure that they are um, creating those systems, or creating that psychologically safe environment where people can give feedback. And until that's the case, then the leader needs to be the one to give the feedback. Sorry, I'm giving my own like whole spiel on this, but it's like really hitting me, like what was happening with that situation in the moment. I couldn't
Yeah.
see it because I was working there, but
Sure.
yeah, but that all makes a lot of
The other
sense.
differential that's in that dynamic that you've described is, so not only did you not have the culture, the systems in place, but the fact that somebody else was in another team means there's a power differential that also confuses things. So
Mm-hmm.
in most organizations, there's some sort of hierarchy, even in the flatter type of organizations, and status and power can be wielded in a very useful, collaborative, collective way, or it can not be wielded in that way, which
Mm-hmm.
then causes people to bite their tongue if they are expected to try and call somebody out who's in another team and more senior. Not going to happen unless you have
Mm-hmm.
the culture and systems to support it.
Right.
We are naturally deferential to people with more authority to us because they wield so much potential influence over the future direction of our careers. So there is this silencing that often happens in hierarchy,
Mm-hmm.
unless we specifically and very deliberately craft a culture and practices that dismantles a little bit of that. And even
Mm-hmm.
then, there will always be this little adhesion, I guess, when a leader comes into the room, a leader who has authority and status to go along with whatever. They can't just sit equally at the table. There will always be what I refer to in power games as a crown. They've got the crown, and that carries some weight,
Mm-hmm.
responsibility as well as influence with the weight of that
Mm-hmm.
crown.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It is such a tough thing. Like in that situation that I was explaining, like I also, I guess as a leader, I've always, had teams, I've built teams and managed teams. But I think of it like if it were somebody reporting to me, I would want to know if there was a problem so that it was on my radar so that I can also
Yeah.
make sure that I'm coaching them around, these things that are coming up. And so that was the other thing for me where I was thinking like somebody leading this person, somebody, the manager, whatever, needs to be aware of the issue, because if they're not, that's not going to come up in their review. It's not
Yeah.
going to. So there's just so many man, the systems thing, I just keep coming back to that in my mind. That makes so much sense that if you have those in place, then then that.
It reduces the temperature and likelihood of
Mhm.
greater conflict. It doesn't necessarily eliminate it.
Right.
So yeah, like I think I've become more of a tempered realist over the years. We're thinking, oh, we have this great system, we have these team agreements, the culture is sorted. That's not often the reality. There's a
Hmm.
lot of personal jealousies that come up, and power games do emerge depending because it sits within a whole ecosystem of an organization, an industry sector, etc. And
Hmm.
this can cause a lot of tension that we didn't anticipate, even with the best system in the world. So as a leader, yeah, you want to know what's going on with your team. So how do you balance
Right.
that with encouraging people to solve their own issues as colleagues? It's
Right.
kind of then it's about developing awareness and emotional intelligence as an individual to know what should I
Yeah.
report to the boss and what's just between me and Kelly. What we just have a
Right.
disagreement about something, then let's sort it out ourselves and carry on. If it's something more intractable and sinister, then that's what we need to be able to assess as individuals in a team. It's like, okay, I think the boss really needs to know about this. Now the boss probably
Hmm.
wants to know everything because then you don't get blindsided by things.
Right. Right. So I'm
Yeah.
curious about the work you do with organizations then. Do you talking about developing those, all of those ecosystem things that you were talking about, that's not easy to go in and make those changes, but how do you work with organizations to I don't know, to help them develop those ecosystems and work with their leaders, their all of those things. What do you do with the organizations?
It's often a triangulation of approaches. So depending on the status or state of the team and organization, we might start with a culture reset, like I did this week, where it's like, let's get the fundamentals in place in terms of understanding who we are, how we operate, and how we're going to work together. So sometimes we start there. Sometimes they're a team that's in progress has been working together, and we just work on strategy. So we work on what's next for the team and organization to develop a strategy. And then the bridge between the two is often some leadership development training where we work
Okay.
on how to give and receive effective feedback, how to have difficult conversations, how to coach and delegate, how to do all those kinds of things. So it's kind of the three-pronged approach. We've got working on culture piece and all the systems and frameworks for that, working on strategy to make sure we're actually going in the direction that we want to do, and building the skills to bridge the two.
Okay, that's awesome. I love the work you're doing. That's amazing. Um, well, I am going to link to people stuff in the show notes, but also where can people find you? What is the best way for people to reach out if they want to learn more about what you're doing?
You can There's probably three different ways. One, you can just hop on LinkedIn and find me there, Zoë Routh, Zoe Routh, Routh like mouth with an R. There is my own website, zoerouth.com. And if you click on blog there, you can get access to people's stuff, holus bolus, whole bunch of free bonuses that when you sign up for my newsletter there. And the third place is to listen into my own podcast called The Future of Leadership, which is available on
Nice.
all the usual podcasting platforms.
Awesome. Well, that's great. I definitely will add that one to my list of podcasts to listen to. Well, thank you so much, Zoe. This was great. We didn't even get into talking about your writing or publishing process, like I told you we might, but you just had so much to share on the leadership side that I loved learning more about that. So thank you so much.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, Kelly. It's been terrific.
For a community of women writers to support and inspire you on your journey, join the Author Power Circle. Connect weekly with fellow authors, stay accountable, and move your book forward in an encouraging community. Learn more at kellyshuckneck.com.